And we are so, so happy that you guys are here, Clarissa. We are very, very fortunate to hear what you can have, are able to share with us. We are super excited and we can't wait for it. So everyone, please stand up and just give a round of applause for Clarissa Coetzee from the Hillsong at Cape Town.
Thank you so much. It is so good to be here. Yes, it is true. I'm with child, and we're pretty excited. We were first like, wait, what just happened? And now we're really excited. And it's just been a few months, so bear with me if, like, I don't know, anything could happen. Anything could happen. But we are so pumped to be here. We had a little road trip this morning, and I was like, okay, this is actually so cool. It's really cool when you come, I don't know, so far out of your comfort zone or so far out of your hometown, and you see that God's still doing something in another place. Like, you've never been here, but it's the same God, it's the same church, it's the same people of God, and that's comforting. And we all know COVID has not been kind to churches during this time, but I love it because I feel like there's going to be a resurgence. So it's like a whole new groundswell, a whole new energy, a whole new passion for God is going to emerge. And this is just the beginning. And so it's really cool to be in your Young Adults Conference. And I know it could be a little bit smaller, but this is actually the beginning. We actually just opened a location nearby us, and because of COVID, it's very restricted. But we love it, and we keep saying, we actually love it because one day we're going to look back on these days and say, these are the pioneering days, and these are the people that started it, and these are the people that were there in the beginning, and this is the community, and this is the time to get to know everyone, and this is the time to get to build into who you are as a core, and then you'll be stronger in the future. And so it's so cool to be here. But the kind of, I speak English, obviously, as you've worked that out. I do understand Afrikaans, so I'm sorry if you don't understand English, but ek sal nie vandag mooi met julle praat nie, so I'm just going to speak English, and if you don't understand something, I'm so sorry, but it's just going to be better that way. So, I wanted to speak to you about a little funny thing. It's called, the title of my message today is called, Don't Shop When You're Hungry, okay? Now, you must be like, that's an interesting topic. Now, right now, in this season of my life, this has become very real. It was real before, but this is now very real. And so what I mean by not shopping when you're hungry, I don't know if you've ever gone to the shops, and you're like, all I need is some milk, maybe a bread. And you walk into the shops, and literally, it's like you're hungry. And so I don't know what you call it. I call it sometimes hangry, when I'm a little bit angry and hungry. But then you're in the shops, and you know on your shopping list, your focus, you should only get 2 things. But in the end, you start looking around, and you start buying everything. Especially now, I buy everything. The other day, I was in the shops, and I bought Oreos. Like, I bought some chips. I bought, I think I bought 2 cans of peaches. Now, I don't know when last I bought cans of peaches, but that's what I wanted. And then I bought a box of Fruit Loops. Now, I haven't eaten Fruit Loops since I was like 16, and I bought Fruit Loops, and then I kind of was like, do I want Fruit Loops or cornflakes? So I bought both. The other day, one day, Vessel went to the shops just to get eggs. We wanted breakfast. The shops were just around the corner. He went to go get eggs. He came back with sausages and custard donuts. And I was like, he was like, I was just too hungry. And then I started buying stuff. And I'm like, what is it? It's like this weird panic frenzy. Like, you look at your basket and you go, maybe I do not have enough food right now. I'm so hungry that maybe I just need something more. And you're like, oh, but that looks good. And whatever you see, you end up wanting. I don't know what it is. I guess it's how adverts work. Whatever you see, if you're hungry and you see Spur, like, it's like all of a sudden you want Spur, okay? And so what ends up happening is you either end up with way too much food, or you start panicking and just buying random things. Right now, I buy the randomest things. Or you start making decisions out of emotions, and you're like, oh, I'm just so hungry, I just want everything. Or you usually, let's be honest, it's not like you end up with like 2 more things of broccoli. You end up with like 2 chocolate slabs, or you end up with junk food. You always end up with something that you're like, I'm not going to touch it, and then you end up with a can of Coke or 6 in your cart. And you're like, why have I got that? And often it doesn't make sense. Like those peaches. I have no idea. I mean, I ate the whole thing, but then I was like, why did I buy it in the first place? But the funny thing about it is, it's such a random example, but the funny thing about it is that kind of principle can actually apply to a lot of areas of our life. And so it's almost like this, like if you're starved of love, you'll find yourself in relationships you should never be in. Or if you are fearful or panic or make decisions out of emotion about your future, you'll end up making bad ones, and you'll end up making impulsive ones, and you'll end up making ones that you should never have made in the first place. Or if you're not thinking straight, and if you operate out of hunger or emptiness, or if you're not full of God's word or His Spirit, if you're empty, you're going to start making decisions about and getting a warped perspective of who you are and your worth. And maybe you don't have a purpose. And that's usually right around the time when anxiety and depression sets in, is when you're not thinking straight. And your mind isn't in a good place because you're deprived and you're hungry. And you start operating out of desperation, but not in the good sense for God, but out of an emptiness. And you start, in the end, basically, is settling. So you end up not with what's best for you. You end up settling for things. And the funny thing is, this example is kind of in a story in the Bible. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase it for you because it's a little bit long, and I don't want to sit here reading 50,000 chapters. But it's about the Israelites, and it's in 1 Samuel, and you can go read it. But at this time in the Bible, the Israelites are God's chosen people, right? And at this time, they've been actually taken out of Egypt. God's led them out of Egypt. He's parted the Red Sea. He's led them into the wilderness and then provided for them. You know, he's killed their enemies, and he's provided manna. And it's at a stage where at this time they are governed by God, or they are governed by a priest called Samuel. And Samuel's job, he's an excellent leader. He's such a good leader. And he operates as their priest and their judge, right? And at this time, actually, everything's going well. He's great, he's good, he's just, and nobody actually has an issue. And so what starts happening is that they see that Samuel's really great, and then they looked at his sons, and they're like, we don't love your sons that much, because they don't really follow the same ways. And they automatically, I don't know how they got to it, but they automatically go, Samuel, we love you, we don't love your sons, and we foresee in the future, we've made this connection. We've come up with something that I don't think we want to be ruled and governed by them anymore. We want a king. They say, we want a king. And Samuel's like, what do you mean you want a king? And he is like, he is hurt, he's distressed, he's distraught. So he goes back to God, and he goes, God, like, they have rejected me. They've rejected like me being their priest and governing them. They've rejected me. And God says, no, don't worry, Samuel. They haven't rejected you. They've rejected me. Because ultimately I was choosing who's governing them. And they're going, we don't want that anymore. And so God says, okay, listen, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go back to them and say, I'll give you a king, but you need to know this. I'm going to warn you about something. You need to know what's going to happen. And so in 1 Samuel 8:22, it says this. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his right. So he's saying, like, this is your warning. If you get a king, this is what will happen. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some of them will be assigned to commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest. Still, others will make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants will be the best. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys will be taken for his own use. And he will take 1/10 of your flocks. And when that day comes, you will cry out for relief from your king you have chosen. But the Lord would not answer you in that day. But the people refused to listen to Samuel. They said, no, we want a king over us. And then we will be like all the other nations with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles. It's like the craziest thing, because ultimately they said, all those consequences we don't actually care about. We see something and it looks better to us than what we have. It's almost like when you're in a shop and you're hungry and you're not in your right mind and you see something and you go, I want that over what I've set out to come for. So they see that everyone has a king, and they're like, we want that. We don't care. And so there's 3 things that you can learn out of what the Israelites had to learn, and what they wanted and what they ended up with, what they were going to get and what they had been planned for and what they had been chosen for and what they ended up settling for because they were doing it out of a hunger and a desperation. And so the first thing is this. They wanted a king. They wanted faith and freedom, but they ended up settling for fear and failure. The funny thing is that Samuel at that point was actually an excellent leader. Everything was going good. He actually ruled and reigned over them perfectly. And you know what I've realized is sometimes it's easier to turn away from God's ways when everything's going good than when you actually need something. Put it like this. I don't know if you've ever met somebody. I can think in our church, 10 people off the top of my head, that they've come to church as a single person. Then they meet someone. They're like, Lord, give me a godly spouse. Like, give me someone that is going to just be, like, I need someone. Give me someone. Then they get someone and they leave church. And you're like, where, like, have you seen? And then that same person will end up, say, breaking up with his girlfriend, coming back to church, and we're like, did you break up with your girlfriend? And they're like, no, I just really need to get back to God. And I've realized, like, it's actually him who I need. And then they find another girl and they leave again. Or they come to church and they're like, I just need financial breakthrough. God, like, would you give me a job? Then they get a job and they're like, it's actually super tiring on a Sunday, so I'm not really actually going to come to church anymore. So they get what they asked for, and God blesses them, and then they leave him. And so it's kind of like they go, maybe everything's actually going really good. Maybe we don't need him anymore. Like, maybe he hasn't actually got the best for me. Like, maybe he doesn't know what's going on anymore. And so they go like, Samuel, your sons, like, they aren't great. And so maybe, like, God's losing his edge a little. You know, maybe he doesn't actually, like, know what's going to happen next. And now that I think about it, does he actually know what's going to happen next? And, you know, have you seen everybody else's king? And have you seen that their king goes out to lead them in battles? And but, like, can you imagine somebody goes over to them and they're like, hey, where's your king? And they're like, no, we don't have a king. And they're like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, we have this guy. He kind of goes and then he does, like, offerings and stuff. And he, like, intervenes for us. And then this God, like, helps us. And they're like, no, but where's your king? Like, where's your king that goes out in battle and, like, leads you guys? And they're like, no, we've got this God, but, like, you can't see him ever. And so, you know, but he's there and he, like, helps and stuff. Can you imagine? And so after a while, they start going like, well, actually, we want that. And maybe God doesn't have it anymore. And maybe because, like, Samuel's sons aren't good. And maybe what happens if? And so fear starts to set in, and they start making this decision out of panic. And ultimately, they wanted something that they could see and touch. Because having faith is hard, but having something you can see, a ruler, a king that you can see, is so much easier. And let me tell you this, don't ever compromise your faith because you serve a God that you can't see, and the world serves a man they can. Because ultimately, that's what we're called to do as Christians. Faith is hard, but it's what we have to do. And that's what the people of Israel needed to do. They needed to just believe and have faith and not walk by sight. You know, as Christians, we're called to have faith. It's the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen. So they served this God they could not see, and they couldn't fathom on it. They couldn't fathom it. But you know what happened was, they started to lose trust in God, and they started putting trust in the things that they could see, which was usually temporary. It's always temporary. When we start putting faith in things we can see, it's temporary. And you know what it does? It gives us a false sense of security. So we feel safe. We feel safe for the moment, but it can't last. And so they wanted this faith and this freedom. They wanted to be able to do what everybody else was doing. They thought, this is what's going to be better for us. But they ended up with actually fear and failure, and started making decisions out of that. And it was detrimental to everything. And so that's the first thing. The second thing you can see is that they wanted to be chosen. They wanted to be something special, but they settled for conformity and comparison. So they wanted to be chosen, but they settled for conformity and comparison. The funny thing is that they were chosen people, and all of a sudden they became sick of it. They were so unique. They were the only people governed by God himself. They were chosen, right? They were set apart. They were gifted. They were gifted in grace to be governed by God himself. That is insane. But they started to despise it. They started to go like, actually, we don't want that. And actually, if we compare what we have to other people, theirs looks a little bit better because we don't actually know what's going on with ours. And so they started to compare what they had, and they started to despise it. And that's what comparison will always lead. If you compare your own life to anybody else, you will always start to despise what you have. You will always start to want to conform. And so ultimately what they were doing is they were saying, we care what we look like. And we look at everybody else and we see what they look like. And we want what they have. And when you start to compare when you start to care about your outward appearance, you will always be chasing kings to give you some significance, to give you some value, to give you some worth. Now, kings could be your bank balance, your position, your career, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, the way you look, the way you dress, the way people see you. That could be your king. And if you care about those things, you will always chase them for all of time. And you will always look at them to fill something, to fill a void. And so ultimately, that's what they were doing. They were looking for importance. And they thought, okay, this is what's going to give us importance. They actually said this. They said, we want to be ruled and governed by a king who will no doubt bring us royalty and splendor. In other words, they said, we want to look good to the world. And can I tell you that the world's things are always less than God's things? They are always lesser than. His ways are higher. His thoughts are higher. His plans are higher. It cannot compare. But if you want to look good to the world, you're going to settle for things that will always be less than what God has best for you. And the fact of the thing is that Israel was called to be unique. And so are we. We're chosen and called to be unique. We're chosen to be set apart. But if you despise that and if you start to conform to the world's ways, you will always start living under your potential, less than what God's called you to be. And right now at this age, wherever you find yourself, you have to settle in your heart that it may look different. You have to settle in your heart that when the world goes, okay, it's crazy, you guys don't have a king, what's that about? If the world says to you, that's crazy, you're going to church on a Saturday to be at a Young Adults seminar conference, that's crazy. You have to settle in your heart that that's okay. If they don't understand it, that's okay. If your friends don't understand it, that's okay. If your family doesn't understand it, that's okay. If your boss doesn't understand it, if anything in the world does not understand it, that is okay. But you have to settle that now because you're not going to get that from the world. They are not going to give you that satisfaction. In Romans 12, it says, don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your eyes on God. Later on, it says, unlike the culture around you, dragging you down to its level of immaturity. And then it says, like, God wants to raise you up. And that's what it does. The culture will always bring you down. It has never lifted people up. Never. And so if you trust in God, He will always elevate you, make you chosen and unique, and give you purpose. But if you want to conform and fit in and go, I want what everybody else is, it's going to be less than. It's going to be full of conformity. It's going to be settling and just taking average. And we were never called to be average. And so the third thing is this. They wanted a deliverer, but they settled for dissatisfaction and deception. This is the crazy thing. In verse 19, the people of Israel say this. They wanted a king who could go out before them and fight their battles. They wanted a king who could go out before them and fight their battles. I'm like, they had one. They had one that whole time. God had delivered them victory after victory after victory. And all of a sudden, they'd forgotten everything He'd done. And it didn't make sense. They were governed by the all-powerful God who'd done miracles, who'd killed armies for them, who'd provided for them. He did everything they'd asked for, everything. And all of a sudden, they're like, no, I think we're good. And actually, that doesn't make sense. Like, if you think of it logically, you're going, guys, that doesn't make sense. Like, it's God. Like, you guys win. You guys win every time. You have God. And it doesn't make sense. But here's what happened. They just let a little bit of dissatisfaction and discontentment creep up in their heart. And we do the same. It can happen to us as well. If it's like one day, all of a sudden you go like, does God have the best for me? Like, does he actually know what he's doing? Just that one thought. And it's a small thought, and the more you think about it, the more it creeps up. And so they start going like, wait, does God actually know what he's doing? Because like Samuel's sons aren't like great. So I had this thought, like, does he actually know what he's doing? And that one thought can spread, and it grows. It doesn't just stay one thought. You start going like, wait, does he actually know? Actually, now that I think about it, like, what are we actually doing? Like, does he know? And then you start thinking about, why don't we have a king? Like, why can't we have someone who's in the battles? And why can't, what is that? Dissatisfaction. From what? Nothing has happened. All of a sudden, you're 10 steps ahead, and you're at a path where you don't even know how you got there. And it's so funny because it's kind of like you have the thought, like, maybe God's holding out on us. Like, maybe there's something better, and he doesn't want to give it to us. And you know, the funny thing is, that sounds very similar to the Garden of Eden, because Adam and Eve, they chatted, and the snake came, and he said, take this apple fruit, whatever, and, like, it's actually going to give you this. And the thought they had was, maybe God doesn't have the best for us, and maybe he's holding out on us. Like, maybe we can actually have this, and he doesn't want to give it to us for some reason. And maybe he's holding out on us, and maybe he doesn't have the best for us. And that small thought is so dangerous. Because if we think of it, even in our own lives today, if we think maybe God doesn't have, we start making decisions based off of that. That means we go, if God doesn't have the best for me, that means I need to work it out on my own. That means I'm going to start making decisions on my own without him. That means actually this life as a Christian, maybe that isn't the best. And it can snowball into the worst thing, and that's what it did. And you end up, it's kind of like when you're shopping hungry. You end up buying junk food. You end up with something that you should have never had in the first place. And so they end up having a king, someone that was less than God. They end up having this guy, and God goes, okay, well, let me help you then. I'll give you a king. Let me help you. He goes, I'll anoint him, and I'll choose someone really great. And that's how he starts out. This king starts out great. And they're like, see, we told you, it's going to be awesome. But because it's a man and not God who's steadfast, because it's man, and man's fickle and temporary, like I said, and man cannot stay the same. And the king ends up ruling with fear. He ruled out of fear, and it was destruction. And he hid from his enemies in the end. Like, he hid from them. And he became his own God, and he became full of self-importance, and it cost them everything. And so that's what ends up happening when you shop hungry. You end up buying so much excess. Like, you end up buying so much stuff that, well, you've got to end up paying for. So you end up with bags of stuff that you didn't want, and it costs you more than anything. God warned them. He said, if you want a king, he's going to take chariots from you, and he's going to take your men and your daughters, and he's going to take all of that. And they said, we want a king. And we can think that's crazy, but ultimately I think about our own lives, and I think, what price do we pay when we fail to make God the king of our lives? What price do we pay every single day when we fail to make Jesus Lord of our lives? Lord over areas that maybe we push him out of. Maybe we push him out of things that we go like, no, God, like, you're like Lord and King, but not over this thing. Like, I've got this. Like, I don't think you know exactly what's going on yet, so I got this. I can work it out. And it's so funny because we want a king, they wanted a king, and we had one. You know, God did everything. He did everything to save the Israelites, and they still rejected him. And, Jesus did everything for us, and we still reject him. We reject him all the time. We reject him. The whole world rejects him all the time. We reject him sort of area. We push him out, and we go like, I don't know, like, living for you is cool, but sometimes it's not, and I don't know if I want to do this all the time. And he did everything for us, and we can look at the story and go like, these guys are so stupid. Like, they had everything. Like, they had the good life, and then they chose to do it themselves. They chose something else. Like, why would they do that? But we do it every day too. God says, I will give you everything. You can lack nothing. And we go, that's cool. We want to do something else. We go, like, it sounds good, but we're going to choose this. And he goes, okay, but if you choose this way, like, it's going to take stuff from you. It's going to cost you things. There's a price to pay. If sin leads to death, and we go, we still want it. Like, we still want that. And it sounds funny in that scenario, but we do it all the time. And then I think about it, and ultimately it's so funny because, like, if a king is so bad, like, why did God give it to them? And it's crazy because I think God was saying, like, well, I don't need you to come up to my standards for me to listen and care for you. And he goes like, well, if you want one, I'm going to give it to you, but I'm going to warn you. And then they say, that's fine, and he gives it to them. But actually, I pray that I will never get to a place where I get what I want and know what's best for me. Because how many times have we prayed, God, I would like this, God, I want this, and not prayed, God, your will be done. Like, God, I would love this, but your will be, like, when last have you prayed to God, I want this, but not my will, your will be done? Because ultimately, that's us asking for stuff every day that we want. And he's saying, like, okay, like, I can give it to you, but you need to know this is what's going to happen. And we choose it. But I don't want to get to a place where I do not choose God's will for my life. But you know, it's so cool because in this whole story, God turns everything for his glory. I mean, everything. Anytime we make a mistake, God can turn it around. And so ultimately, he uses all of it. All the kings that come after that, king after king, the good ones, the bad ones, he uses it all, and he sets this platform up. And he sets it up so that everybody would recognize that Jesus is king. Ultimately, the whole story revolved around us realizing actually what a good, steadfast King of all kings God is, and Jesus who came to save us. See, in the beginning, they wanted to be chosen. They wanted faith and freedom. They wanted a deliverance. So God goes, okay, well, you messed up, and this is what the consequence is, but I'm sending Jesus, and he's going to give it to you again. This is round 2, so, get it right this time. And so he comes again, and he gives us freedom, and he gives us faith, and he's our deliverer, and he gives us victory after victory after victory. And now he's going, would you choose it? Would you choose Jesus as king of your life? Because it's up to you. He's not saying, I'm not going to force it on you. This is your decision. And so, ultimately, the question of today is, at this very moment, who is the king of your heart? Because sometimes we can make decisions out of our emotions and out of places that we should never be in, out of emptiness, out of hunger, we're starved inside, and ultimately we can make decisions that won't ever benefit us. But if we get back to putting God on the throne in our hearts, he's always been on the throne, but if we say, okay, today, on Saturday, the 1st of May, is it 1st of May? That's cool. On Saturday, the 1st of May, would I choose to put God back on the throne in my heart? Would I choose to make Jesus king over my heart again? In every area, not just the ones that we think and feel good about, the ones that we feel fearful about, the ones that we've conformed to the culture of our ways, the culture of the world's ways, the areas that we kind of hide, the areas about our career, the areas about who we love, the areas about what we think we're called to do, those areas, would you put God back in again? And so if everyone could stand for me, I just want to pray for everyone. Because I feel like if we all just take a moment and we're honest, it's just you here. Don't even care about the person standing on your left and right. If you're honest for a second and you said to yourself and you honestly have reevaluated your heart and you said, okay, what is the condition of my heart right now? Have I put things that God's given me, that God's done for me, the blessings he's given me over God himself? Have I given the very thing that God's done over and over, the victories, have I given that a higher place over God in my heart? Have I given the blessing, maybe his fruitfulness in my life, have I put that over God in my heart? What is king over my heart right now? What is ruling? What are the prevailing thoughts? Is it fear? Is it anxiety? Is it depression? Is it emptiness? Because we have to get back to a place where we've put him back on the throne in our hearts, that he is then king and Lord of our hearts. Because he'll give us the option, and we need to choose. He's a God that doesn't force himself. He'll say, listen, you get to choose, but you have to choose me. You have to choose me in every area. I won't do it for you. I'm not going to force myself. And yes, you've made the decision to be here, so that's already something. But I'm talking about the hidden parts, the parts that you don't even talk about, the parts that you've thought about. Or maybe it's because you're so fearful about what the world thinks of you that you limit yourself and you live small and you live in a very constricted and refined way because you think like maybe that's not what the world thinks is cool and maybe they won't like me, and you've lived in the fear of man. Or maybe you feel empty, like you actually feel like you've lived out of a place of emptiness and that you're not enough for ages and that you're like, God, you need to fill me up again. You need to be king of my life again. And so if every eye is closed and every head is bowed, I'm just going to pray for you. I'm not going to ask you to put up a hand. I'm not even going to ask you to do anything. I just want you to be honest with yourself. It's just a moment between you and God. And if you said, honestly, God, I need to change some things in my life. I need to make you king of my heart again, because you are far more important than I've put you to be. You have far more for me. And maybe I've cared about what the world thinks of me. And maybe I've cared about what my outward appearance is. And maybe I've cared about that. Sometimes when being a Christian looks different and I don't know how to explain that to my friends and family. God, would you be the king of my heart again? And maybe I have dreams that I've let die because I've thought that you couldn't do it. And maybe I've taken my trust out of you and put it into man. And maybe I've preferred to trust things that I can see than a God that I can't. God, would you be king of my heart again? God, and maybe I've lived in fear and anxiety. Maybe the past 2 years of things going crazy has put fear in me and I've thought maybe like, God, you're not in control. Like maybe, do you know what's happening? And maybe I've let anxiety and fear, stop me from living what I'm supposed to be living. God, would you be king of my heart again? So Lord, we pray that you would fill us up again, that we wouldn't shop hungry. We wouldn't look around and compare our lives to anybody. We wouldn't stress, we wouldn't worry, Lord, because you are king of our heart and you have delivered us day in and day out. And so, Lord, we choose you again to be king of our heart. Jesus, you've already paid for stuff that we're still paying for. So, Lord, we accept you as Lord and Savior. We accept you as our deliverer. We thank you that we are chosen and called by you. We thank you that we haven't done anything to earn it, but you just want to give it to us freely. And we thank you that means we have faith and freedom in you. Thank you for being king of our heart. And everybody who believed that said, Amen.